The sun was setting behind the acacia trees, casting long shadows across the grounds of St. Teresa's boarding school for girls. The school, nestled in the heart of Kenya, was renowned for its academic excellence and strict discipline. At the helm was Mrs. Evelyn Kamau, a woman whose iron fist had guided the institution to unparalleled heights. Her reputation as a fair yet formidable headmistress was well known, but beneath the surface lay an unyielding ambition for her daughter, Grace Kamau. Grace had always been the star student, her name synonymous with perfection. She had never known what it felt like to be second best, and her mother had ensured that she always remained at the pinnacle of her class. That was until the arrival of Amina and Njoroge. Amina, with her radiant smile and quiet confidence, was an enigma. Transferring from a rural school, she had quickly adapted to the rigors of St. Teresa's, impressing both teachers and students alike with her intellect and work ethic. It wasn't long before she began to outshine Grace, a fact that did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Kamau. The quarterly exams had come and gone, and the results were pinned on the notice board in the main hallway. Amina's name topped the list, with Grace following closely behind. Whispers filled the corridors, and Grace's usual group of friends began to distance themselves, wary of the growing tension. Grace felt the weight of her mother's expectations pressing down on her. Each evening, she sat at her desk in their private quarters, poring over her books, trying to reclaim her position. Mrs. Kamau would occasionally peek in, her face a mask of disapproval at any sign of Grace's struggle. "Grace, you need to focus. How do you expect to become a doctor if you let someone like Amina surpass you?" she would say, her voice cold and unyielding. Grace's nights grew longer and her days more stressful. The pressure was immense, and she found herself growing resentful of Amina, whose natural brilliance seemed effortless. But Amina was not only smart, she was kind-hearted, often offering help to those who needed it, including Grace. This only fueled Grace's frustration and sense of inadequacy. One evening, as Grace sat hunched over her desk, Amina knocked softly on the door. She entered with a smile, carrying a stack of notes. "Grace, I thought you might find these helpful for the upcoming biology exam," Amina said, her eyes shining with genuine warmth. Grace looked up, her face a mask of exhaustion. "Thanks, Amina. I appreciate it," she replied, trying to muster a smile. Amina's presence was like a ray of sunshine in the dark room, but it also cast a shadow on Grace's already fragile self-esteem. The contrast between Amina's effortless kindness and her own internal turmoil was stark. Mrs. Kamau's resentment towards Amina grew with each passing day. She could see the strain it was putting on Grace and knew that something had to be done. The thought of her daughter being overshadowed by another student was unbearable. Her mind began to craft a sinister plan, one that would ensure Grace's return to the top. It was a stormy night when Mrs. Kamau decided to put her plan into action. The rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees. The perfect cover for what she was about to do. Mrs. Kamau donned a dark cloak and made her way to the dormitory. She moved silently, like a shadow, ensuring that no one saw her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve was unshaken. She reached Amina's bed and looked down at the sleeping girl, her face peaceful and innocent. With a deep breath, Mrs. Kamau pulled out a pillow and pressed it over Amina's face. The girl struggled, her eyes flying open in shock, but Mrs. Kamau was strong and determined. It was over quickly. Amina lay still, her bright future snuffed out in an instant. The next morning, the school was in chaos. Amina's body had been discovered, and the authorities were called. Students and teachers alike were in shock, unable to comprehend the sudden loss. Mrs. Kamau maintained her composure, playing the role of the concerned headmistress to perfection. "We must find out what happened," she declared to the gathered staff and students, her voice steady. "Amina was a bright and promising student. We owe it to her and her family to get to the bottom of this." Grace, however, was not so easily fooled. She knew her mother too well. The tension between them had been palpable, and Grace had seen the look of determination in her mother's eyes in the days leading up to Amina's death. She suspected the worst but was torn between loyalty to her mother and the horror of the act she believed had been committed. As the investigation progressed, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Mrs. Kamau's alibi had holes, and witnesses had seen a cloaked figure entering the dormitory that night. The police began to piece together the truth, and it wasn't long before the evidence pointed to Mrs. Kamau. The arrest of Mrs. Kamau sent shockwaves through the school and the community. The once revered headmistress was now a pariah, her reputation in tatters. Grace was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, struggling with the knowledge of what her mother had done. In the months that followed, St. Teresa's tried to heal from the trauma. Amina's memory was honored with a scholarship in her name, ensuring that her legacy would live on. Grace, despite the burden of her mother's actions, found solace in her studies, determined to honor Amina's memory in her own way. The story of Mrs. Kamau's fall from grace served as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the devastating consequences it could have. The school slowly returned to its former state of excellence, but the shadow of that stormy night would never be forgotten. Grace sat alone in her room, the weight of the past months pressing heavily on her shoulders. The once vibrant space, filled with laughter and dreams, now felt like a prison. She flipped through her textbooks, trying to focus, but the words blurred on the page. Amina's face haunted her thoughts, a constant reminder of what her mother had done. The school had set up a memorial for Amina, a small garden with a plaque bearing her name. It was a place for students to reflect and remember the bright girl who had touched so many lives. Grace visited often, finding a strange comfort in the solitude it offered. She would sit on the bench, staring at the flowers, and whisper apologies into the wind. One afternoon, as Grace sat in the garden, a figure approached. It was Amina's younger brother, Kofi. He had transferred to St. Teresa's on a scholarship created in his sister's honor. His presence was a reminder of the impact Amina had, but it also carried the weight of unresolved grief. "Grace," Kofi said softly, sitting down beside her. "I know you were close to my sister. She spoke about you often." Grace nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Kofi, I'm so sorry. I wish things had been different." Kofi placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle yet firm. "We can't change the past, but we can honor her memory by being the best versions of ourselves. Amina wouldn't want us to be consumed by this darkness." His words resonated with Grace, sparking a glimmer of hope in her heart. She realized that while the past could not be undone, the future was still within her control. She vowed to work hard, not just for herself, but for Amina and Kofi, who had shown her the strength to move forward. As the months passed, Grace threw herself into her studies with renewed determination. She sought help from her teachers, attended study groups, and even reached out to other students for support. Slowly, her grades improved, and she began to regain her confidence. The school community also began to heal. The creation of the Amina and Njoroge Scholarship Fund brought a sense of purpose and unity. It provided opportunities for students from underprivileged backgrounds to receive quality education, ensuring that Amina's legacy lived on. Mrs. Kamau's trial was a somber affair. The evidence was damning, and she was sentenced to life in prison. The once formidable headmistress sat silently as the verdict was read, her expression devoid of the fire that had once driven her. Grace visited her mother only once, unable to reconcile the woman before her with the mother she had known. "Why, mother?" Grace had asked, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you do it?" Mrs. Kamau's eyes had filled with regret, but she remained silent. There were no words that could justify her actions, and Grace left, feeling a mixture of sorrow and relief. In the years that followed, Grace graduated from St. Teresa's with top honors. She went on to attend university, pursuing a degree in medicine. Each step of the way, she carried Amina's memory with her, using it as a source of strength and inspiration. Kofi also excelled in his studies.